Welcome back, everyone. We've got quite the deep dive for you today based on some material you sent in. The Key to Theosophy by H.P. Blavatsky.
Yeah.
And right away, Blavatsky is, thanking fellow Theosophists for all their input. So this wasn't just her, like, sitting in a room coming up with all this stuff.
Yeah, it definitely seems like a collaborative effort.
Yeah.
Sort of this shared exploration and investigation.
Yeah, and it gives you that sense that Theosophy isn't just like a fixed set of doctrines, but it's like a living, evolving understanding.
A living tradition.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, so in this deep dive, we really want to unpack some of the core ideas of Theosophy as Blavatsky presents them.
Okay.
And also sort of clarify how it stands apart from other spiritual and philosophical systems. So let's start with, I guess, a very basic question that a lot of people might have.
Right.
Is Theosophy a religion?
Yeah, that's a big one. Because according to our source here, it's a definite no.
Okay.
Theosophy is not a religion.
Interesting.
Instead, it's described as divine knowledge or science.
So you know when they use that label, it seems like they're really trying to emphasize that this is something that's knowable, investigable. You can study it. It's not just a matter of faith.
Exactly. It's not just about blind belief. It's about there's a system and you can investigate it.
Right. A structured way of understanding the divine.
Exactly. Okay. So now let's look at the term theosophy itself.
Yeah.
It comes from the Greek theosophia, meaning wisdom of the gods.
Okay.
But, it's important to note here that theos doesn't necessarily mean God in like the modern monotheistic sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Like the capital G God.
Exactly.
Think of it more as like a divine essence.
Right, a divine being in a more general sense.
Yeah, and kind of like what you'd find in theogony, which is the genealogy of the gods.
Oh, okay, interesting.
And this term theosophy is ancient.
Really?
It goes back thousands of years.
So this isn't just something that, popped up recently. It has a long history.
It's got a long history, yeah.
If we kind of connect this to like the bigger picture of ancient thought, the idea of multiple divine beings or emanations of the divine was actually pretty common.
Yeah.
So theos in this context really seems to point to that broader understanding of the spiritual realm.
And also kind of like claiming that lineage.
Right. The age of the term really emphasizes that claim to be this timeless wisdom.
Yeah.
It's not just a recent invention.
Okay, so the source traces the origins of this term back to the Alexandrian philosophers.
Okay.
Specifically, the Phileletheans, lovers of truth.
Interesting.
And it formally kind of emerges in the 3rd century CE with Ammonius Saccas and this diverse or eclectic theosophical system that he came up with.
So what's interesting about Ammonius Saccas is that he tried to bring together all these different philosophical and religious ideas of his time.
Yeah.
And that actually really aligns with Theosophy's own approach of drawing from all these different sources.
It does.
So it really emphasizes that inclusive nature right from the start.
Yeah. So you, the listener, might be wondering, is there a single go-to system within Theosophy? And the answer, according to our source, is basically none. And all.
None and all.
When it comes to specific religions or philosophies, the idea is you take the best.
So it's really about recognizing those fundamental truths that exist across these different traditions.
Exactly. And it's worth noting here that Theosophy itself is divided into exoteric and esoteric sections. Just like...
Kind of like the mystery schools of the past?
Yeah, exactly. Like
where there were levels of understanding and the deeper teachings were only accessible to those who were prepared.
Right. Okay, so let's move into what our source calls the core of Theosophy, starting with this concept of divine wisdom. And it suggests that this wisdom can be accessed. However, there's a very strong warning against just jumping into things like occultism or theurgy without a qualified teacher.
Interesting. So why is that?
Because they say that ancient texts are highly symbolic.
I see.
And misinterpreting them can lead to things like unconscious black magic or the most helpless mediumship.
So it seems like they're really emphasizing the potential risks involved in engaging with these powerful forces Without the proper guidance.
Without the right understanding.
And the right ethical foundation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And also the idea that at the time this was written, there wasn't a lot of clear, accurate occult knowledge available.
That was readily available.
Yeah, readily available in the West.
Especially in the West, right?
So this was like a big concern. So how does this inner group within the Theosophical Society actually learn?
Yeah, how does that work?
Well, it's not always through direct personal contact with these true initiates or masters of esoteric wisdom.
Okay.
Instead, instructions are often passed down through dedicated students.
So it's kind of like a lineage of wisdom being passed down.
Yeah, and they use this really striking analogy.
Okay.
An ounce of gold is worth a ton of dust.
That's a great analogy.
To illustrate the value of even a small amount of genuine knowledge.
Yeah, that really captures the idea that when it comes to spiritual understanding, it's about quality over quantity.
Yeah.
A little bit of true insight is so much more valuable than a huge amount of superficial information.
Okay, so then how do we tell the difference?
Yeah, how do you discern?
Between the real knowledge and something that's false. They offer another really powerful analogy.
Okay.
A tree is known by its fruits, a system by its results. So they challenge us to think. Have solitary occult students achieve the same level of wisdom and impact as figures like Ammonius Saccas or Apollonius of Tyana?
That's a good question.
Who often had guidance from teachers or were part of systems, and they point out the limitations of even very talented people if they don't have a complete understanding.
So it seems like they're really emphasizing the importance of that guidance and a systematic approach for real spiritual growth.
So now let's get into the relationship between Theosophy and Spiritualism.
Okay.
They are very clear about the distinction between Theosophy and occultism. You can be a good Theosophist without being an occultist.
Okay.
But a true occultist must be a Theosophist to avoid becoming a black magician.
That's interesting. So it seems like Theosophy provides kind of the ethical framework, the understanding of universal interconnectedness.
Yes.
That's really necessary to practice occultism responsibly.
Exactly.
Without that ethical grounding.
Yeah.
Occult abilities could be misused for selfish purposes.
Exactly.
Which is where that term black magician comes from.
Now, the text also acknowledges that some people look at occult sciences as just these remnants of ignorance. But then they quickly point out that some people say the same thing about religion. But they also note that at the time, there was this growing interest in both hypnotism and theosophy.
Okay.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Theosophists might believe in things that seem supernatural.
Okay.
But occultists practice what they call a scientific theosophy, based on natural laws.
So they're really trying to bridge that gap between what we might call the supernatural and the scientific. So even though there might be these phenomena that we don't fully understand, they believe there are natural laws that govern those things.
And they caution against just trying to use these abnormal powers without the guiding light of occultism.
Okay.
Because they say that can lead to dangerous mediumship.
Yeah, because you could be messing with things that you don't fully understand, and that could be harmful.
Okay, let's talk about the theosophical view of spirit and how it manifests.
All right.
The way they see it is that the divine spark within each of us is fundamentally connected to the universal spirit.
Okay.
And this connection gives us the potential for omniscience. However, that potential is limited by matter.
Right, because we're embodied.
Exactly. So when those limitations are reduced, like in deep sleep or a trance state, that inner self can manifest more fully.
So that's their explanation for these exceptional states of awareness and knowledge that sometimes occur.
And they also briefly mention lower order spiritualist manifestations. They say, look, we don't want to interfere with anyone's beliefs, but if you believe in these spirits, the burden of proof is on you. So they're kind of taking this cautious stance.
Yeah, they seem a little bit skeptical.
Yeah, they're skeptical
of those lower order phenomena.
Okay. Now, there's a point made about whether the TS was founded to just crush spiritualism.
Interesting.
And they say, no, that's not it.
Okay.
Theosophy's beliefs are founded on this idea of immortal individuality.
Okay.
And they go on to clarify the crucial difference.
Yeah, that seems really important.
Between personality and individuality.
What's the distinction there?
Okay, so think of your personality as everything that makes up you in this particular lifetime.
Right.
Your name, your quirks, your memories.
Okay.
Individuality is that deeper enduring spark that travels through multiple lifetimes.
Oh, I see.
So it's that thread of continuity.
So personality is temporary.
Yeah.
It's tied to a specific lifetime.
Exactly.
But the individuality is what endures.
Yeah. And they say that this difference is the key reason why theosophical and spiritualist teachings diverge.
Yeah.
In fact, they claim that theosophy is the true and pure spiritualism, while modern spiritualism as practiced is simply transcendental materialism.
Okay, so they're saying that spiritualism, while acknowledging a spiritual realm, often just focuses on communicating with discarnate personalities.
Right.
Rather than this deeper understanding of the spiritual self in its journey.
Yeah. Okay, so let's switch gears a bit and look at some of the reasons they give for Theosophy's appeal.
What are some of the reasons people might be drawn to it?
Okay, well, they point to several things. First, there was this reaction against the very materialistic scientific theories. Right.
That were kind of dominant at the time?
That were popular at the time in academic circles.
Yeah.
So it's like people were looking for something more than just the material world.
Second, they point to dissatisfaction with Christian theology.
Okay.
In particular, its many conflicting branches.
Right.
And a growing awareness that these beliefs might actually contradict each other.
So a desire for something more coherent.
Yes.
And intellectually satisfying.
Yeah. And they also say there was this feeling that conventional religions weren't really improving people's morality. And there was this desire for a philosophical and religious system that felt scientific.
Right.
It wasn't just based on speculation.
Yeah, so a system that could kind of answer those big questions in a way that made sense.
Exactly.
So it's kind of a picture of a society.
It is.
It was grappling with some deep unease.
Yeah. Okay, so now Theosophy offers its own perspective.
Okay. On the origin of humanity.
And what is that?
They say we come from this absolute essence from which everything emerges, into which everything eventually returns.
So it's that idea of a single source for all of existence.
Yeah.
And this is something that resonates with many mystical and philosophical traditions.
Yeah, and they link this to this idea of the ancient Aryan philosophy as represented by the Vedantins and Buddhists.
Okay.
And they connect this belief to the theosophical duty to promote non-sectarian education.
So because we all come from the same source, we should focus on education that unites rather than divides.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about ethics?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Does the TS have its own set of ethical guidelines?
They do, and they say it's considered to be the essence and cream of the ethics of the world.
Really? Drawing from...
So they're really drawing on the wisdom of different cultures.
In different traditions.
Yeah, like Confucius, Zoroaster, Buddha, Jesus, Hillel.
Wow.
The Greek philosophers.
It's a pretty diverse approach.
It is very. Okay, let's dive into their concept of God and prayer.
Okay.
The source reminds us that theosophy itself is not a religion, but it's rather the essence of all religions.
Okay.
And they use this really great analogy here.
Okay.
Imagine white light containing all the colors of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Each religion is like one of those colors claiming to be the whole light.
So they're all coming from the same source,
yeah,
but expressing it in different ways.
Now, when it comes to the Christian God, this personal, extra-cosmic, anthropomorphic creator, Theosophy is very clear.
Okay.
They do not believe in this God.
Okay, so they're taking a different approach.
They are. They consider this theological concept to be a bundle of contradictions and a logical impossibility.
So they're really focusing more on these impersonal principles rather than a personal deity.
And the reason they reject this concept is because they say, look, it's a contradiction for an infinite and absolute God to have defined attributes and to engage in creation in a finite way.
That makes sense.
So then what about prayer in Theosophy?
Yeah. That's a good question.
Well, the answer is pretty direct.
Okay.
They act instead of speak.
So they're emphasizing action over petition.
And they don't offer prayers to this absolute principle.
Okay.
Because they say the unknowable is only capable of relations within itself.
Okay.
And the visible universe operates according to its own laws.
So they're saying that the universe has its own inherent principles, and that asking for intervention from an external deity is not how it works.
Exactly.
Okay.
And they say that they don't believe in prayer as this external petition to some unknown God. However,
they do introduce this idea of will prayer.
Will prayer.
Which they describe as an internal command.
Oh, interesting.
Rather than a petition.
Okay.
And this is directed towards our Father in heaven, but in its esoteric meaning, which they say is within each of us.
So it's that inner divinity that they're connecting with. So it's not about asking for something externally. It's more about this internal transformation.
Exactly. And this Father is not some anthropomorphic conception. It is the divine essence within us.
Okay.
And they even quote the biblical passage about being the temple of God to kind of support this. Prayer, in this sense, is a spiritual transmutation.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it.
Of our finite thoughts into spiritual will through intense aspiration.
So it's about aligning our will with that higher aspect within ourselves. And they warn very clearly
against using this will force for selfish purposes.
They do.
And they equate that to black magic.
Yeah.
So there's a strong ethical component here.
Yeah, and they contrast this with, you know, the common practice of warring factions praying to the same God for victory. Which they see as this kind of distorted understanding. Now, they also address the fact that prayer exists across so many cultures.
It's a universal practice in many ways.
Yeah, and they say, look, prayer has multiple meanings. It's not just about asking for something. It can also include invocation and something akin to enchantment, like you defined in Hindu mantras.
Interesting.
And they highlight the selfish nature of much prayer, and they say, look, this can actually be harmful. It undermines our self-reliance, and it inflates our ego.
So instead of relying on this external force,
they say the theosophical approach is to focus on communion and acting in unison with our inner Father, and ultimately merging with this universal essence in states like samadhi or nirvana.
So it's about a more experiential form of spiritual connection.
And they reject prayer to finite beings, which they call idolatry, and prayer to the absolute for reasons we've already discussed. Instead, they say, focus on meritorious actions.
So it's really about walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Now, they address this accusation from Christians that theosophy is prideful and blasphemous. And their argument is, look, it's actually more prideful to believe that the infinite would listen to every foolish little prayer.
Like we could command the attention of the divine in that way.
Exactly. And they say it's blasphemous to suggest that an all-knowing God actually needs our prayers.
To know what to do.
To figure out what to do.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And they cite teachings of Buddha and Jesus, interpreted esoterically, of course, to support their focus on action.
So they're trying to show that their interpretation aligns with deeper esoteric understandings.
Finally, on this topic of God and prayer. They challenge this tendency to dismiss unexplained events as just mysteries of God. They say, look, theosophy rejects those kinds of easy answers.
So they're not satisfied with just attributing everything to an unknowable will.
Okay, so let's shift our attention now to the Buddhist influence on theosophy. The source discusses Buddhist teachings on the soul. And they differentiate between the more common exoteric view, which is that there's no permanent unchanging soul, and then the more esoteric perspectives. And they explain this concept of skandhas. So think of your personality as a collection of these constantly changing elements.
Yeah, like a bundle of changing characteristics.
And they say that in each rebirth, a new personality is formed by a recombination of these elements.
So there's still a thread of continuity. Even though the specifics change. That makes sense.
And then they contrast this with a theosophical view. Theosophy says that only the radiation of spirit or atma is present in what they call the astral vehicle. And they believe that humans must earn immortality.
Earn immortality.
Yeah, by striving toward unity with this spirit.
So it's not something that's just given. It's something that we have to work towards.
It's an active process.
Right.
So individualization after death depends on the spirit, not on the soul and the body as we typically understand them.
So again, they're really emphasizing that enduring nature of the spiritual essence.
Yeah.
And they also talk about this shining thread that connects the spirit and the soul.
And they say that this thread actually breaks. In cases of like irredeemable black magicians.
So that's a pretty significant consequence.
Yeah.
So it seems like there's a real danger in misusing those spiritual powers.
Yeah. And this leads to the annihilation of the personal soul.
Right, because you've severed that connection.
And if the lower mind or manas doesn't achieve union with the reincarnating ego during life, the lower mind dissolves.
Right.
But the ego itself remains.
So there's a real need for that alignment between the personal mind and the higher ego.
Exactly.
Okay, so this brings up the question of why Theosophy doesn't believe in God as a form-bound entity.
Well, they argue that anything infinite and unconditioned cannot have a form or be a defined being.
Yeah, because those things imply limitations.
Exactly.
Right.
And they say that entities are only immortal in their ultimate essence.
Okay.
Eventually merging back into this universal spirit.
So it's a return to the source.
Yeah.
Rather than an internal preservation of individual form.
And they also say that the personal soul's memory of a single lifetime only really lasts through what they call the devacanic period.
So that's like a post-death state of
it's like a
mental bliss.
A blissful mental state.
Yeah.
Now they address this idea of the apparent cruelty of life.
Right, because it doesn't always seem fair.
Yeah, and this concept of a judging God.
Yeah.
And they argue that a just divine principle wouldn't arbitrarily create souls just to make them suffer.
That doesn't seem very just.
Yeah.
So they're offering a different perspective on suffering, seeing it as the consequence of our own actions.
And it's interesting they point out that even some Jewish philosophers actually believed in reincarnation.
So that offers a different way of understanding why we experience the things we do.
Okay, so let's tackle this misconception about nirvana.
Okay, because it's often misunderstood.
It is. The source explains that it's not annihilation. Okay. It's the literal destruction of personality and differentiated matter.
So it's not about ceasing to exist.
Right.
It's more about transcending those limitations of our individual existence.
And they say, surprisingly, that early Christian fathers actually held very similar views on reincarnation and the threefold nature of man.
So those ideas were present in early Christianity as well.
They say that a lot of the confusion arose from how the words soul and spirit were translated. Expert speaker.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.